The last frontier. In the later 19th century, the last American frontier was transformed by America's rapid population growth and industrial development. The frontier has generally been defined as the line separating areas of settlement from unsettled wilderness territory. From another point of view, the American frontier marked the dividing line between areas where Native Americans lived and the areas settled by more technologically advanced people. Your essential question for this lecture is what factors contributed to the settlement of the Great Plains and the Far West? Please make sure you write this at the top of a notebook page. The shifting frontier. Since the arrival of the first colonists, the American frontier has shifted steadily westward. By the end of the Civil War, American settlers occupied the Midwestern prairies and had a foothold along the Pacific coast. Between these two lines was a vast expanse of territory. Much of this last frontier consisted of the Great Plains, home to millions of buffalo and Native American Indians who lived off their food and hides. There were also mountains, deserts, and basin areas. The lure of precious metals. Even before the Civil War, settlers had been drawn to the California gold rush of 1848 and 1849. In 1896, a Californian and two Indian friends found a gold nugget near Canada's Klondike River, near Alaska. This set off one of the most turbulent gold rushes in history. Within months, 100,000 gold seekers set out for the Yukon. The voyage was long, hard, and cold, and only 30,000 completed the trip, with most giving up along the way. Still others discovered gold and silver in Alaska, the Rocky Mountains, and the Black Hills of South Dakota. Thousands of prospectors and venturers moved to these areas in hopes of striking it rich. Rough and ready mining towns sprang up overnight. Often they collapsed just as fast when the minerals ran out or a larger mining company took over. The impact of railroads. As we learned in the last lecture, the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, reduced the journey from New York to San Francisco from 6 months to just 10 days. Rail travel increased dramatically with its completion. Soon the United States led the world with more railroad track mileage than England and France combined. The railroads attracted an increasing number of settlers to the West. Settlers could now ship their crops by rail to distant eastern markets. Railroad tracks also often ran through Native American territories, leading to new conflicts. From 1870 to 1890, the herds of buffalo on the Great Plains were destroyed by sharpshooters traveling by train. This development affected the ability of Plains Indians to remain living on the plains. The availability of cheap land. Before the Civil War, the federal government had sold unsettled land from its vast public domain for about $1.25 an acre. After the southern states seceded, the remaining states passed several bills that the South had previously blocked. These laws encouraged expansion in the West. President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act in 1862. This act stated that any citizen could occupy 160 acres of government land. If the settler improved the land by making a home and growing crops, after 5 years the homesteader would own that property. Many European immigrants were attracted by this offer of free land. Almost 1.4 million homesteads were eventually granted under this act.
The Great Plains, conquered by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad threads a thin line of civilization through the wilderness. People follow. In just 1 year, 40,000 settlers moved to Nebraska, fanning out across the frontier in wagon trains.
When in the mid-19th century to the late 19th century, they went out and settled some hostile territory known to mankind in the Great Plains where I grew up. These were true pioneers.
The government accelerates the process with the greatest land giveaway in history. Anyone with a $10 filing fee can claim free land. A quarter are single women and ex-slaves.
When you see the desperate scramble in these rickety wagon trains, you realized that the promise of America was land. These are people who never in a million years would be able to own land in Europe.
Eventually, 10% of the United States will be given away under the Homestead Act.
The cattle industry. At the end of the Civil War, there were several million wild longhorn cattle grazing on the Great Plains in Texas. Some Texans decided to drive these cattle northward to the railroad lines in Kansas. From Kansas, the cattle were shipped to Chicago to be slaughtered. The beef was then shipped by refrigerated rail cars to cities in the east. It took about 3 months to drive the herds north from Texas across Indian Territory to Kansas. On this long drive, the cattle grazed on the grasses of the open range, unfenced lands not belonging to anyone. Cowboys who learned to ride, rope, and brand from Mexican vaqueros kept the herds moving northward. The romantic image of the cowboy has become a symbol of the individualism of the American spirit. Western music, with its root in British folk ballads, celebrates cowboy life. In fact, most cowboys led lonely, isolated lives, dependent on the herd owners for work. As many as 1 in 5 cowboys was African American. In the late 1870s and 1880s, the herds were driven farther north a year before they were ready for slaughter. They fattened themselves by grazing on the plains of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. However, by 1886, overgrazing had destroyed much of the grass. Sheep herders and farmers had bought up much of the open range and enclosed it with barbed wire fences. 2 severe winters and very hot summers killed millions of cattle in 1886 and 1887, finally ending the long drive. But cattle ranchers remained, breeding cattle on the closed range and sending their cattle eastward by train each year to be fattened by eastern farmers. Farming the Great Plains. The railroads also led farmers to occupy the Great Plains. The Homestead Act and the sale of railroad land grants stimulated the movement of farmers westward. The railroads made it possible for farmers on the Great Plains to ship their crops to the east. About half of the settlers were immigrants from Europe. The other half were the children of farmers from the east and Midwest. At first, these farmers faced the hostility of both Indians and cattlemen. The Indians were defeated by federal troops in the Indian Wars. The cattlemen formed associations and hired men to commit acts of violence against the early homesteaders. Eventually, the farmers won this conflict because they came in greater numbers and were able to enclose their lands with barbed wire. Farming obstacles. The farmers faced many natural obstacles on the Great Plains. From railroad advertisements, they had expected to find well-watered, wooded lands. Instead, when they arrived, they found little rainfall, few trees, tough soil, extreme temperatures, plagues of grasshoppers, and personal isolation. Some starved or returned to the east. Families that stayed were forced to do endless hours of heavy work. During the winter months, families might be snowed in for months on end. With technological ingenuity, they were able to overcome many obstacles. To make up for the lack of trees, they built sod houses from clumps of grass and soil. They used barbed wire to keep cattle and other animals off their farms. They used steel plows to turn the soil, drilling equipment to dig deep water wells, and windmills to haul water. They used harvesters and threshers to farm more acres with fewer workers. The fate of Native Americans. Native American Indians once occupied all of the present United States. They were composed of many different groups, speaking hundreds of different languages. The advancing line of settlement and diseases from Eurasia, like smallpox, severely reduced Native American populations and pushed them westward. Government policy. From 1830 to 1890, the U.S. government systematically followed a policy of pushing Native Americans from their traditional lands onto government reservations in the West. There were 4 main factors for declining Indian presence in the West. They are 1. Forced removal. In 1830, Congress ordered the removal of all Native American Indians to west of the Mississippi. Nearly 1/4 of the Cherokees perished on the journey westward, known as the Trail of Tears. 2. A flood of settlers. Large numbers of settlers overwhelmed the Native Americans. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Along with the Homestead Act, the continuation of railroad lines made Native American lands even more desirable. 3. Warfare. The technological superiority of the U.S. government made resistance futile. The Indian Wars, which pitted settlers and federal troops against Native Americans, lasted from 1860 to 1890. And 4. The destruction of natural environment. Competition between settlers, miners, and farmers for the land led to the destruction of the natural environment on which Native Americans depended for their livelihood. The reservation. Once a particular Native American tribe submitted to federal authority, its members were settled on a reservation. Reservation lands were usually smaller than the lands from which the tribe was removed and often consisted of undesirable land. The federal government promised food, blankets, and seed, but this policy clashed with tribal customs since Native Americans were traditionally hunters, not farmers. The Dawes Act of 1887. Many reformers urged that Native Americans undergo Americanization, adopting the culture of other mainstream Americans. The Dawes Act sought to hasten their Americanization. The act officially abolished Native American tribes. Each family was given 160 acres of reservation land as its own private property. Private property was expected to replace tribal land ownership, and each Native American would become a farmer. Those who adopted this way of life were promised U.S. citizenship and the right to vote. Before the Dawes Act, Indians still controlled about 150 million acres. 20 years later, 2/3 of this land was sold. White settlers bought up much of the Indian Territory, which then became the state of Oklahoma. Although well-intended, the Dawes Act nearly destroyed surviving Native American Indian culture. There were 4 main shortcomings of the Dawes Act. First, it threatened tribal ways. Assimilation threatened Native American culture. The act encouraged individual farm ownership, opposing the tradition of sharing tribal lands. Second, Native Americans were hunters, not farmers. Many Native American Indian tribes had never farmed the land, since they were hunters by lifestyle and tradition. Third, the lands were infertile. The lands given to the Native American Indians were often infertile. The government also never provided farm equipment or assistance in learning how to farm. And fourth, reservation life. These reservations often suffered from malnutrition, poverty, and untreated health problems. Reservation schools provided an inferior education. The American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Before 1924, Native Americans held a unique position under federal law. Some had become citizens by marriage to a U.S. citizen. Others were granted citizenship by serving in the U.S. military or through special treaties. Most Native Americans, however, were still not U.S. citizens, and they were actually blocked from the normal process of naturalization open to foreigners. In 1924, the U.S. Congress therefore passed the American Indian Citizenship Act. This law granted immediate U.S. citizenship to all Native American Indians born in the United States. Under the new act, Indians did not need to give up tribal lands or customs to become citizens, as they did under the former Dawes Act. Some historians see the act as a reward for Native American enlistment as soldiers in World War I. Since Native American Indians had served the nation in wartime, they deserved to be given American citizenship. 10 years later, the Dawes Act was replaced by an act guaranteeing tribal self-government.